It was a crisp, cool morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the kind of day where the sun broke gently through the clouds, casting golden streaks across the tarmac. Passengers bustled through the terminal, wheeling luggage and juggling coffee cups as announcements echoed overhead. Amid the controlled chaos, one figure stood out, not because he was trying to, but because of the quiet dignity he carried with him. Colonel James Bradford was a man who commanded respect without saying a word. Tall and imposing, his military uniform, adorned with medals that told the story of decades of service, caught the eyes of passers-by. But today wasn't about his rank or his accolades. Today was about duty of a different kind, a solemn, personal mission to escort a fallen comrade home. In his hand he held a folded American flag, the weight of it heavier than anything he carried before. At Gate 24, passengers were boarding a flight to Dallas. The airline staff moved briskly, scanning tickets and ushering people onto the plane. Colonel Bradford approached the counter, his expression calm but purposeful. He introduced himself, explained his role, and requested early boarding, a courtesy extended to military personnel on such missions. The staff at the counter glanced at him, their expressions unreadable, before one of them, a young man in a crisp uniform, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir," the attendant said, his tone clipped, "but we can't make any exceptions. You'll have to board with your assigned group." Colonel Bradford blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't one to pull rank or demand special treatment, but this wasn't just any flight. His role as an escort for a fallen soldier wasn't about privilege, it was about honor. He calmly explained the significance of his request again, but the attendant remained firm, shaking his head as other passengers behind him began to murmur. The moment was small, almost inconsequential to those watching, but for Colonel Bradford, it was a quiet blow. He stepped aside, his jaw tightening as he held the folded flag a little closer to his chest. Around him, some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others buried their faces in their phones, unwilling to get involved. The boarding process continued, and Colonel Bradford waited patiently for his group to be called. When he finally boarded, he found his seat near the back of the plane, away from the hustle and bustle of the premium sections. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, their cheerful tones contrasting sharply with the weight of his thoughts. As the plane taxied down the runway, Colonel Bradford stared out the window, the folded flag resting on his lap. He couldn't help but think about the young soldier whose body lay in the cargo hold below, a life cut tragically short, a family waiting on the other side, their hearts shattered. The indignity of the earlier exchange gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the responsibility he had to uphold. Unbeknownst to him, a passenger seated a few rows ahead had noticed the entire interaction at the gate. This woman, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, had recognized the colonel's uniform and understood immediately the gravity of his mission. She'd stayed quiet at first, unsure of how to intervene, but as the flight progressed, something about the situation didn't sit right with her. By the time the plane landed in Dallas, a quiet buzz had started to spread among the passengers. The woman had spoken to others on the flight, sharing what she'd witnessed, and by the time they reached the terminal, an unexpected ripple effect had begun to unfold. What started as a moment of quiet frustration for Colonel Bradford was about to become something much bigger, something that would remind everyone watching that honor, respect, and humanity are values worth fighting for. Little did anyone know, the story of what had transpired on that flight was about to go viral, sparking outrage, inspiring action, and forcing the airline to face the consequences of its decision. But that, of course, is where things really get interesting. As the passengers shuffled off the plane and into the bustling Dallas terminal, Colonel James Bradford kept his composure, his steps steady, though the weight of the flag in his hands felt heavier with each passing moment. The terminal was alive with the sounds of announcements, laughter, and hurried conversations. Yet, for the colonel, the noise seemed distant, muffled under the gravity of his task. His focus was singular, to deliver this young soldier home to his grieving family with the honor and dignity they deserved. Nearby, the woman who had witnessed everything was keeping an eye on him. Her name was Sandra Clark, a schoolteacher from Houston who was traveling to visit her sister. Sandra was known for her sharp sense of justice and a heart that rarely let her walk away from something wrong. Throughout the flight, she had wrestled with her own thoughts, replaying the gate attendant's dismissive tone and the way the colonel had been made to wait, as though his mission were no different than someone hurrying for a connecting flight. It didn't sit right with her. Sandra decided she wasn't going to let this slide. She approached the colonel as he stood near the baggage claim, his posture as straight and disciplined as ever. Up close, she noticed the lines etched into his face, each one a testament to years of service and sacrifice. "Excuse me, Colonel," Sandra said gently, her voice cutting through the noise. He turned, his sharp eyes meeting hers, and offered a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am," he responded, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back at the gate," Sandra began, choosing her words carefully. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. You shouldn't have been treated that way. What you're doing, it's important, and I think it deserves respect." The colonel studied her for a moment, his expression softening slightly. He gave her a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," he said simply, "but it's not about me, it's about him." He glanced down at the flag in his hands, the unspoken weight of his words hanging in the air. Sandra nodded, understanding more than he realized. She felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't change what had already happened, but maybe she could do something to make sure the world knew about it. As the colonel walked away to meet the military escort waiting for him, Sandra pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, recounting the incident on her social media page. She didn't use the colonel's name, she respected his privacy, but she described the uniform, the folded flag, and the way he had been denied the small courtesy of early boarding. Sandra's post didn't take long to gain traction. Within hours, it was being shared across multiple platforms, the comments section filling with outrage and support. People were tagging the airline, demanding accountability, while others shared their own stories of witnessing or experiencing similar disrespect. What started as a simple post from a concerned citizen was quickly snowballing into something much bigger. Meanwhile, the colonel had no idea of the storm brewing online. He was focused on the next steps of his journey, working closely with the military honor guard to ensure every detail was handled with the precision and care the fallen soldier deserved. It was a process he had been through before, but it never got easier. Every flag, every name, every grieving family, they stayed with him, each one a reminder of the sacrifices that came with the uniform. The family of the fallen soldier, Private First Class Andrew Martinez, was waiting at a private area near the tarmac. The young man's parents, Maria and Carlos, stood holding each other tightly, their faces etched with a grief too deep for words. Colonel Bradford approached them with quiet respect, offering his condolences before handing over the flag with a solemn promise that their son's sacrifice would never be forgotten. It was a moment of profound pain and quiet dignity, one that felt a world away from the commotion unfolding online. By the time Colonel Bradford left the airport, the story had reached local news outlets. Reporters were picking up on Sandra's post, and people were demanding a statement from the airline. Hashtags like #HonorOurHeroes and #RespectTFallen began trending, amplifying the story far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Calls flooded the airline's customer service lines with veterans, active duty military members, and civilians alike expressing their outrage. The airline, initially unaware of the growing backlash, was forced to respond quickly. A spokesperson released a brief statement saying they were looking into the incident and valuing the service of all military personnel, but the response only added fuel to the fire, with critics calling it vague and insufficient. People wanted more than words, they wanted action. Sandra, still tracking the reaction to her post, felt a mix of pride and unease. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, And while she believed in the power of holding institutions accountable, she also worried about the colonel. She hoped the attention wouldn't bring him unwanted stress or overshadow the purpose of his journey. As for Colonel Bradford, he remained blissfully unaware of the growing controversy. His focus was on honoring Private Martinez, attending the young man's memorial service, and ensuring the family had everything they needed. But it wasn't long before someone from his unit reached out to him, letting him know about the uproar. The colonel listened quietly as the situation was explained to him, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me," he said finally, his tone firm. "It's about the soldier. The focus should be on him and his family." But the colonel's humility only added to the story's power. By the following day, major national networks were covering the incident. Veterans organizations issued statements of support, and a well-known public figure, a retired general, weighed in, calling it a stark reminder of the need to respect and honor those who serve. Back at the airline's corporate headquarters, the executive team scrambled to control the narrative. They scheduled a meeting to discuss their next steps, realizing the situation had spiraled far beyond what they had anticipated. Pressure was mounting, and the eyes of the nation were on them. Colonel Bradford, however, remained focused on his mission. The young soldier had been laid to rest, and the colonel spent time with the family, sharing stories of their son's bravery and assuring them that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. It was only after his duties were complete that he allowed himself a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. Sitting alone in his hotel room, the colonel scrolled through his phone, catching up on the news. He saw the posts, the articles, the hashtags, and while part of him felt a pang of frustration at being thrust into the spotlight, another part of him was quietly grateful. If this attention reminded people of the importance of honoring those who served, perhaps some good could come of it. Little did he know, the events of the past 48 hours were only the beginning. The ripple effects of that one moment at the gate were about to lead to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The airline was preparing a public apology, but the real story, the one about how a nation responded to a moment of perceived injustice, was still unfolding. As the days passed, the uproar surrounding the airline's treatment of Colonel James Bradford refused to die down. What had started as a quiet act of injustice witnessed by a handful of passengers had now grown into a nationwide conversation. News segments replayed Sandra Clark's initial post, while social media buzzed with debates about respect, military service, and corporate accountability. The airline's tepid response only fueled the fire, with many calling for a direct acknowledgement and tangible changes in their policies. At the heart of it all, Colonel Bradford went about his days as he always had, quietly and with purpose. He had no interest in fame or attention, and yet his name was now known to millions. Calls from journalists and media outlets came in regularly, but he turned them down politely, reiterating that his focus remained on honoring Private Andrew Martinez. However, it became harder to avoid the spotlight when some of his fellow service members reached out, sharing their own stories of being overlooked or mistreated in public spaces. Many thanked him for unintentionally shining a light on an issue they felt had long been ignored. Meanwhile, Sandra found herself swept up in a whirlwind she hadn't expected. Her post, written in the heat of the moment, had transformed her into an unlikely voice for change. People were reaching out to her, thanking her for speaking up, while others questioned whether the incident was being blown out of proportion. She struggled with the weight of it all, wondering if she had done the right thing by sharing what she saw. But as she read through the countless messages of support from veterans and their families, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. If her words could spark a conversation, maybe they could lead to something meaningful. The airline, now fully aware of the PR disaster unfolding, scrambled to contain the damage. Internal emails revealed a flurry of meetings between executives, PR teams, and legal advisors. They debated how to respond. Some pushed for a heartfelt public apology, while others worried about admitting fault and setting a precedent. Tensions ran high as the company faced mounting pressure, not just from the public, but also from veteran organizations threatening to boycott their services. Behind closed doors, the airline's CEO, Margaret Lane, found herself in a difficult position. She had built her career on fostering a reputation for professionalism and efficiency, but this incident had tarnished everything she stood for. Lane was no stranger to crisis, but this felt different. The backlash wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about a deeper issue of respect and values. Late one evening, as she sat in her office poring over reports, a thought struck her. This wasn't just about damage control. It was about doing what was right. At the same time, a group of passengers from the original flight decided to step forward. Inspired by Sandra's courage and outraged by the airline's treatment of the colonel, they began sharing their own perspectives on what they had witnessed. Videos taken at the gate began to surface online, showing the brief but tense exchange between the colonel and the attendant. While the interaction was relatively subdued, the visual evidence added fuel to the narrative. The videos quickly went viral, painting an undeniable picture of the airline's failure to show respect in a moment that demanded it. Among the passengers was a young man named Marcus Reed, a software engineer with a knack for storytelling. Marcus decided to write an open letter to the airline, detailing what he saw and how it had affected him. His letter wasn't angry or accusatory, it was heartfelt, a plea for the company to recognize the significance of their actions and take steps to ensure no one else experienced the same. He posted it online, and within hours, it was shared thousands of times. People from all walks of life, military families, veterans, civilians, rallied around his words, amplifying the call for accountability. While the public pressure mounted, another subplot began to unfold. A former airline employee who had worked as a gate attendant for several years reached out to a local news station with a story of her own. She revealed that the company's training policies often left employees unprepared for situations involving military personnel. She described instances where staff felt torn between following rigid protocols and doing what was morally right. Her testimony added a layer of complexity to the narrative, shifting some of the focus onto systemic issues within the company. As the story continued to grow, a new figure entered the fray: General Nathan Caldwell, a retired four-star general known for his eloquence and advocacy for veterans' rights. General Caldwell had heard about the incident and felt compelled to speak out. In a televised interview, he praised Colonel Bradford's humility and dedication, calling him a true embodiment of what it means to serve. But Caldwell didn't stop there. He challenged the airline and other corporations to do better, urging them to implement policies that respected and honored those who had given so much for their country. The interview struck a chord with viewers, further amplifying the pressure on the airline. Behind the scenes, Colonel Bradford watched the events unfold with a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He appreciated the support, but remained wary of the attention detracting from the true purpose of his mission. Yet, as more voices joined the conversation, he began to realize that this was about more than just one moment at the gate. It was about a broader cultural shift, a reminder to treat people with dignity, regardless of the circumstances. Back at the airline's headquarters, Margaret Lane finally made a decision. She scheduled a press conference, vowing to address the public directly. Her team worked tirelessly to craft a statement that would strike the right balance between apology and action. But as the day of the press conference approached, questions lingered. Would it be enough? Could the company repair the damage and restore trust? The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew the stakes were high. What no one could predict was the surprising twist that would unfold during the press conference, one that would take the story in an entirely unexpected direction. The day of the press conference arrived, and the world was watching. The airline's corporate headquarters had transformed into a fortress of activity. Reporters crowded into the conference room, cameras positioned to capture every word and every gesture. Outside, protesters gathered, many holding signs that read, "Respect our heroes and honor the fallen." Among them were veterans in uniform, their presence adding an unspoken gravity to the event. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a collective anticipation hanging in the air. Margaret Lane stood behind the podium, her expression composed, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She started by acknowledging the incident, offering a carefully worded apology to Colonel Bradford, the Martinez family, and anyone who felt disrespected by the airline's actions. Her tone was measured, and while the words seemed genuine, there was something about them that felt rehearsed, like a performance designed to placate rather than heal. As Lane continued, reporters shifted in their seats, waiting for the moment she would announce what the airline planned to do about the situation. Would there be changes in policy? Would they offer restitution? And most importantly, would they address the systemic issues that had come to light in the aftermath? But before Lane could finish her prepared remarks, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the room. The doors swung open, and Colonel James Bradford himself walked in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in full uniform, with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the ordeal, he moved toward the podium with purpose. The room fell silent, the tension reaching its peak. Margaret Lane froze, her carefully planned speech forgotten. She stepped aside as the colonel approached the microphone, her expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. The cameras turned to him, capturing a moment in perfect clarity. The reporters leaned forward, their pens poised to catch every word. Colonel Bradford stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room. Then, in a voice that was calm but firm, he began to speak. He didn't focus on the airline or the incident at the gate. Instead, he spoke about service, about the sacrifices made by men and women in uniform, and the families who bore the weight of their loss. He spoke about Private Andrew Martinez, a young man with a bright future who had given everything for his country. His words were raw, heartfelt, and unshakably sincere. The room was utterly still as the colonel continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "This isn't about me," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "It's about remembering that behind every uniform is a human being. Someone's son or daughter, someone's parent, someone who deserves respect, not because of their rank or their medals, but because they chose to stand up and serve when others didn't." His words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the walls of that conference room. Viewers watching at home felt a lump rise in their throats, while those in the room blinked back tears. Even Margaret Lane, who had spent years cultivating a tough corporate demeanor, looked visibly moved. But just as the colonel was about to finish, another figure stood up in the audience. It was Sandra Clark. She had come to the press conference on a last-minute whim, feeling compelled to see the story through to the end. She raised her hand, and the colonel nodded, inviting her to speak. Sandra's voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, her conviction grew. She shared why she had posted about the incident, emphasizing that it wasn't about shaming the airline, but about sparking a conversation. "We have to do better," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We have to be better, not just for our soldiers, but for each other." The combination of the colonel's heartfelt speech and Sandra's impassioned plea created a moment that no one in the room would forget. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a collective awakening, a call to action that demanded more than empty apologies and vague promises. Outside the room, the crowd of protesters began to cheer as news of what had happened inside spread. The story was no longer just a scandal. It was a movement, one that challenged everyone, from individuals to corporations, to reflect on their values and their actions. Margaret Lane, still standing to the side, realized there was no script for this moment. She stepped back to the microphone, her voice quieter than before. "Colonel Bradford," she said, "thank you for reminding us of what truly matters. We failed, and for that I'm deeply sorry. But actions speak louder than words, and I want you, and everyone here, to know that we're committed to making real changes." As Lane detailed the steps the airline would take, including new training programs and a dedicated policy for military personnel and their families, the crowd outside erupted in applause. But even as the tension in the room began to ease, the story was far from over. The world would soon learn whether the promises made that day would translate into lasting change. or whether this moment of reckoning would be just another fleeting headline. As Margaret Lane finished her promises, the tension in the room began to lift, but it was far from dissipated. While many saw her commitment to change as a step in the right direction, others remained skeptical. The reporters, sensing there might be more to the story, began firing off questions. Margaret answered cautiously, sticking to her carefully crafted talking points. Yet beneath her polished responses, there was an unease she couldn't shake, a feeling that the airline's troubles were far from over. Then, as the press conference seemed to wind down, a man in civilian clothes stood up from the back of the room. His presence hadn't drawn attention earlier, but now, as he cleared his throat and raised his hand, the cameras shifted toward him. His name was Jason Mills, and he introduced himself as a former baggage handler for the airline. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of frustration. "Before we all congratulate the airline on their promises, I think there's something people need to know," Jason said, his words slicing through the air. The room, which had begun to stir with movement as people prepared to leave, fell silent again. This isn't just about one incident or one soldier. There's a culture here, a culture that values speed and profits over people. Margaret Lane visibly tensed, her polished demeanor cracking for the first time. "Excuse me," she interjected, attempting to regain control, "but this is not the time." Jason held up his hand. "With all due respect, Ms. Lane, it is the time," he said firmly. He turned to the crowd. "I worked for this airline for 6 years. I saw how employees were pressured to hit quotas, how shortcuts were encouraged, and how anyone who spoke up was either silenced or pushed out. This isn't just about one gate agent. This is about a system that fails its workers, its passengers, and in this case, its heroes." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras zoomed in on Jason's determined face, and Margaret Lane, for a fleeting moment, looked genuinely rattled. Sandra Clark, watching from the side, felt her heart race. She had thought the story was about the colonel, about a single moment of disrespect, but now it was clear this was just the tip of the iceberg. Colonel Bradford, still standing at the podium, observed the chaos with a calm, measured expression. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His very presence was enough to command respect, and eventually the room quieted once more. Jason, emboldened by the attention, continued. "Do you know how often we'd hear complaints from passengers about the way military personnel were treated?" he asked, directing his gaze at Lane. "More times than I can count. And we were told to brush it off, to stick to the script. You can promise all the changes you want, but unless you're willing to confront the root of the problem, nothing will change." Margaret Lane stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's enough," she said, though the slight tremble in her tone betrayed her unease. "This press conference is not the place for unfounded accusations." Jason didn't back down. "They're not unfounded," he said, "and you know it." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Reporters scrambled to get Jason's contact information, sensing there was a bigger story to uncover. The focus shifted away from Margaret Lane's promises and onto the deeper issues Jason had exposed. Meanwhile, outside the building, the protesters grew louder, their chants of accountability now echoing through the streets. Sandra, still watching, felt a mixture of emotions. She admired Jason's bravery, but she also worried about how this new development might overshadow Colonel Bradford's message. She glanced at the colonel, whose expression remained composed, though his hands were clasped tightly behind his back. Later that evening, as news outlets replayed clips from the press conference, another twist emerged. An anonymous whistleblower, claiming to be a current employee of the airline, sent a detailed report to a prominent journalist. The report outlined instances of discrimination, poor treatment of passengers, and a pattern of ignoring complaints. It even included internal emails, some of which hinted at the very pressures Jason had described. The story, once centered on a single moment at the gate, had now spiraled into a much larger reckoning for the airline. Social media exploded with calls for further investigation, and several major news networks began digging into the company's history. Customers shared their own negative experiences, and soon #airline culture crisis began trending alongside #HonorOurHeroes. For Margaret Lane, the situation was spiraling out of control. In a late-night meeting with her executive team, she was forced to confront the possibility of lawsuits, federal investigations, and the loss of trust from their most loyal customers. For the first time, she realized that the promises she had made earlier weren't just a gesture, they were a lifeline, and even that might not be enough. Meanwhile, Sandra Clark found herself at the center of an even bigger storm. Journalists reached out to her, eager to know more about what she had seen and what had compelled her to speak up. While part of her wanted to retreat from the spotlight, she also felt a responsibility to see the story through. After all, if one post could spark this much change, what else could be accomplished? As the days went on, the pressure on the airline continued to mount. Jason's accusations had opened a floodgate, and more employees began to come forward, sharing their own stories. Each new revelation added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a company that had long prioritized efficiency over empathy. Colonel Bradford, though reluctant to be part of the media frenzy, couldn't ignore the impact of what was unfolding. For him, the focus had always been on honoring Private Martinez and ensuring his family felt supported. But as he watched the story evolve, he began to see its broader implications. Perhaps this wasn't just about one soldier or one airline. Perhaps this was an opportunity to remind everyone, corporations, individuals, and society as a whole, about the importance of respect, integrity, and humanity. As the whirlwind of events continued to escalate, one thing became clear: the story was far from over. The question now wasn't just whether the airline could repair its reputation, it was whether this moment of reckoning could lead to lasting change, not just for one company, but for everyone watching. The stakes had never been higher, and the world waited anxiously to see what would happen next. In the days following the dramatic press conference, the airline found itself at the center of an even bigger storm. The whistleblower's report had been picked up by major news outlets, and investigative journalists were uncovering more about the company's internal culture. Stories of passengers and employees alike began flooding the internet, many echoing the themes of neglect and disrespect. The outrage wasn't just about the treatment of Colonel Bradford anymore, it had become a symbol of something larger. Colonel Bradford, true to his nature, continued to stay out of the spotlight. He declined interviews and instead focused on his original mission, honoring Private Andrew Martinez. The Martinez family had remained quiet through the ordeal, grieving in their own way, but when Colonel Bradford visited them to deliver a final tribute to their son, they insisted on thanking him. During a small private ceremony in their hometown, the family spoke about Andrew's life, his dreams, and how much his service had meant to them. The Colonel's humility left a lasting impression on the Martinez family. To them, he was more than a soldier. He was a reminder that their son's sacrifice had not been forgotten. Word of the quiet ceremony spread, and many who had followed the story felt a renewed sense of its original purpose, to honor those who serve and sacrifice. Meanwhile, the airline's CEO, Margaret Lane, was forced to take bolder action. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, and the pressure to make meaningful changes was undeniable. Lane announced a series of initiatives, including mandatory training for all employees on how to handle situations involving military personnel, a veteran advisory board to oversee these efforts, and a public fund to support military families in need. She also agreed to an external audit of the company's internal policies, a move that signaled a commitment to transparency. But the turning point came when Lane invited Colonel Bradford to meet with her and the airline's leadership team. While hesitant at first, the colonel ultimately agreed, believing that the conversation could lead to something constructive. In the meeting, Lane apologized personally and asked for his guidance on how the company could truly improve. The colonel, as always, spoke simply and directly. "It's not just about policies or procedures," he said. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person you serve. If your team can remember that, you won't go wrong." Sandra Clark, too, found a way to channel her role in the story into something positive. She used her platform to highlight organizations supporting veterans and military families, encouraging her followers to contribute or volunteer. Though she had never sought fame, she realized that her voice could make a difference, and she embraced the opportunity to advocate for a cause she now felt deeply connected to. Jason Mills, the former baggage handler who had spoken out, became an unlikely hero in his own right. His courage inspired other employees to step forward, and together, they formed a coalition to push for better working conditions and greater respect for both staff and passengers. The airline, under growing scrutiny, began implementing reforms not just for military personnel, but for its entire workforce. As the weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy around the story began to fade, replaced by a quieter but more enduring impact. The airline's new initiatives were met with cautious optimism, and passengers reported seeing small but noticeable changes in the way they were treated. More importantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation about respect, empathy, and the need to honor those who serve, not just with words, but with actions. For Colonel Bradford, life returned to its familiar rhythm. He resumed his work with veterans organizations and continued to mentor young service members, never seeking recognition for what had happened, but grateful that it had led to something meaningful. Occasionally, he would receive letters from strangers thanking him for his quiet strength and integrity, and while he rarely responded, he kept them all, a reminder of the lives he had touched. The Martinez family found solace in knowing their son's memory had inspired change. In their hometown, a small park was dedicated in Andrew's honor, a place where families could gather, children could play, and his story could be remembered. At the park's opening ceremony, the Martinez family invited Colonel Bradford to speak, and though he resisted at first, they insisted. Standing before a small crowd, he spoke not about himself, but about Andrew, his courage, his dreams, and the legacy he had left behind. The story of the airline, the colonel, and the fallen soldier became a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the smallest moments. It showed how a single act of courage, whether it's speaking out at a gate, posting on social media, or stepping up to tell the truth, can ripple outward and create real change. For those who had followed the story, the takeaway was clear. Respect isn't just about grand gestures or public apologies. It's about the choices we make every day to treat others with kindness and dignity. And sometimes it takes the courage of a few to remind us of what we're all capable of. As the sun set over the park that evening, the colonel lingered for a moment, watching as children played and families gathered. It was a quiet, peaceful scene, one that Andrew Martinez would have cherished. With a small, grateful smile, the colonel turned and walked away, knowing that in his own way he had fulfilled his mission.